Across America, something is happening that no one is talking about. Cities that once were bastions of white communities are changing dramatically. People are leaving, not because of economic collapse, but because they don't want to live next to their black neighbors. It's a phenomenon that's been quietly reshaping the country for decades. Today, we look at 15 cities where the shift in racial demographics was too much to bear for many white families. What happens when integration becomes too real for some? You won't believe what we uncover. 1. Gary, Indiana. Once known as the city of the century due to its booming steel industry, Gary, Indiana was the epitome of American industrial success. In the 1950s, it was a thriving town filled with families, jobs, and a hopeful future. But when black families began moving into Gary's previously all-white neighborhoods, things took a turn. As integration became a reality, the discomfort among white residents grew, and the quiet exodus began. By the 1970s, it wasn't just a trickle, it was a mass migration. White families fled to nearby suburbs, and Gary quickly became one of the most stark examples of white flight. The decline of the city, however, is not simply due to black residents moving in. The steel industry collapse, combined with lack of investment and resources, left entire neighborhoods in disrepair. Today, Gary stands as a city with high levels of poverty, abandoned homes, and shuttered businesses, but it is not without its resilience. Black families have remained, adapted, and rebuilt their communities despite the systemic abandonment they faced. While the headlines may focus on the loss, what isn't often told is the untold strength of the people who stayed. But here's the question. Was Gary's fall inevitable, or was it hastened by those who left when change arrived? What if this city could have flourished had it been given the chance? The answer may lie in how we view migration and who really controls the future of a city. 2. Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama is synonymous with the civil rights movement, yet its story is also one of segregation, flight, and racial tensions that persist to this day. In the 1960s, as black citizens fought for equality, white families began to retreat, unwilling to stay in a city where black political and cultural power was rising. Today, over 68% of Birmingham's population is black, a demographic shift that coincided with white families fleeing to suburban communities like Hoover and Mountain Brook. While these suburbs flourished, Birmingham began to develop into a city dominated by black leadership, at the helm of local businesses, government, and schools. But rather than celebrating this shift, many white residents saw it as an uncomfortable reality they could no longer ignore. The flight from the city was not just racial, it was about control, influence, and comfort zones. However, despite this exodus, Birmingham is far from broken. Black entrepreneurs have revitalized the city's economy, and cultural landmarks are thriving like never before. But a lingering question remains. Was Birmingham abandoned because of the growing black presence, or did the loss of investment and resources accelerate its decline? Could it have been saved if those who left had stayed to invest? Or is this just another example of how communities are abandoned when power shifts? The real answer may surprise you, and it might just change how you view the cities we call home. 3. Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, a city that once echoed with the sounds of its thriving industries, now finds itself caught in a demographic shift that has left its inner neighborhoods struggling. East Cleveland, a community that was once a bustling middle-class area, is now over 90% black. But this transformation wasn't gradual, it was accelerated by the departure of white families who could no longer tolerate the increasing racial diversity. As the black population rose, the services, schools, and resources in these neighborhoods slowly deteriorated. The homes were left behind, the businesses shuttered, and the city's decline seemed inevitable. In the 1970s, white residents fled, searching for quieter, more homogeneous places, often moving to suburbs like Parma or Mentor. What followed wasn't just a demographic change, it was a financial and social flight. While white families left, black Clevelanders remained, facing the brunt of economic decay and neglect. They continued to push forward, building businesses, sustaining communities, and creating their own cultural hubs within the city. But with white flight, vital investment and services also disappeared, leaving behind a city in decline, further isolated and neglected by those who once helped it flourish. But here's the question. Did Cleveland suffer because of its racial transformation, or did it suffer because it was abandoned when it needed support the most? Could East Cleveland have survived and even thrived if the resources had stayed in place? This question lingers, but one thing is clear. Black Cleveland has shown resilience, and the real story lies in the cost of that abandonment, a cost we still pay today. 4. Newark, New Jersey. Once a bustling, predominantly white city filled with working-class neighborhoods, Newark, New Jersey became another flashpoint in the story of white flight. In the 1960s, riots fueled by racial tensions sparked the mass exodus of white families from the city. By the 1980s, Newark's white population had dwindled to less than 12%, while black and Latino residents took over the city. What followed was a cycle of disinvestment, neglect, and the perception that Newark was a city to avoid, even as its black residents worked tirelessly to rebuild their communities. The transformation of Newark was driven by more than just race. It was the intersection of racial power, political change, and economic collapse. White families had already left Newark before the riots, but the racial unrest sealed their departure. The shift to a majority black and Latino population was seen as a threat by many, sparking a fear-based migration to the nearby suburbs like Livingston and West Orange. Newark was abandoned, and its future left in the hands of the very communities that had been left behind. However, Newark's story is not one of decline, it is one of perseverance. Despite the exodus, Newark's black and Latino communities rebuilt, revived businesses, and nurtured a vibrant cultural scene. But here's the lingering question. Was Newark really doomed by its racial transformation, or was it the fear of black political power that sent white families running? And what happens when the rest of the world writes off a city and its people, believing only the narrative of decline? Newark's story isn't over, but how it's remembered will depend on how we answer this question.
Number 5. St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis, Missouri is a city divided, not just by its streets, but by its racial makeup. The city's north side, a predominantly black area, is a stark contrast to the largely white suburbs that surround it. This divide didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decades of disinvestment, white flight, and economic decline. As black families gained political power and the city's demographics shifted, white residents abandoned North St. Louis in droves, relocating to suburbs like St. Charles, Chesterfield, and Baldwin. Once a thriving urban center, the city was left to deal with the aftermath of those departures: declining schools, eroded infrastructure, and a general sense of neglect. St. Louis is now over 46% black, and while the city's southern and central areas remain predominantly white, the growing black presence in the north has become a point of contention. White families and businesses have fled, leaving behind a city that is struggling to maintain its former glory. Despite the challenges, North St. Louis has fought back. The community has worked to revive its culture, build local businesses, and push back against the stereotypes that continue to plague it. But here's the question. Is North St. Louis really dangerous, or has it simply been abandoned by those who once controlled its resources? The city's future depends on this answer, whether it remains divided or comes together to heal the wounds of the past. Number 6. Chicago, Illinois. Chicago is a city defined by its racial divide, especially when you look at neighborhoods like Inglewood and North Lawndale, which are predominantly black. Once filled with white families, these areas underwent a transformation during the Great Migration, when black families moved into the city looking for better opportunities in the workforce. As more black residents moved in, white families packed up and fled, heading for suburbs like Oak Park and Schaumburg. This migration was fueled by fear, a sense of losing control, and the desire to maintain a suburban, predominantly white lifestyle. Inglewood and North Lawndale, once home to thriving communities of white working-class families, are now symbols of what happens when resources and investment dry up. While the media often paints these areas as crime-ridden and dangerous, the truth is far more complex. Black Chicagoans who remain have fought to rebuild, creating vibrant cultural scenes, businesses, and community organizations. However, the damage done by white flight, economic disinvestment, underfunded schools, and lack of services remains a powerful force. The real question here is, are these neighborhoods really as dangerous as they're made out to be? Or is the fear rooted in a history of segregation, systemic neglect, and abandonment? And what happens when communities are left to rebuild without the necessary resources? Number 7. Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia is often hailed as the Black Mecca of the South. The city is home to thriving black businesses, powerful political leadership, and a rich cultural legacy that has defined much of the city's success. However, as the black community's influence in Atlanta grew, so did the migration of many white residents away from the urban core. In the 1970s, white families made up over 60% of Atlanta's population, but today that number has dropped to around 38%, and it continues to fall. As black political power surged, many white families fled to suburbs like Alpharetta, Marietta, and Sandy Springs, places where they could avoid the cultural and racial transformation taking place in the heart of Atlanta. While the suburbs flourished, the city of Atlanta began to change in ways that many white families weren't prepared for. Black political leadership, economic empowerment, and cultural pride reached new heights, with black entrepreneurs, artists, and activists reshaping the city's identity. Yet for many white residents, this was not the Atlanta they had known. The flight from the city wasn't just about crime or economic decline. It was about losing control, losing a cultural dominance that had long been part of the city's identity. The question is, why do so many white residents continue to leave a city that's economically booming, culturally vibrant, and filled with opportunities? Could it be that for some, diversity isn't a sign of progress, it's a sign of discomfort? Number 8. Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland, once a vibrant hub of industry and culture, has seen a dramatic shift in its demographics over the last few decades. The city is now around 60% black, but it didn't arrive at this point without controversy. In the mid-20th century, as black families moved into Baltimore's neighborhoods, white families moved out, often retreating to suburbs like Howard County, Harford County, and Anne Arundel County. The flight was gradual but consistent, driven by a mix of racial fear, economic decline, and the perception that the city was no longer safe or desirable for white residents. But while white families fled, the Baltimore community worked to rebuild. The city became a center for black culture, activism, and business. Yet despite this resilience, Baltimore continues to face struggles that many attribute to the absence of white investment and resources. Schools are underfunded, infrastructure is crumbling, and crime is often highlighted as a reason to avoid the city. However, the real question is Baltimore truly suffering because of its black majority? Or is it the result of decades of disinvestment and neglect by those who once held the city's resources? Could Baltimore have been a model for integration if the resources and support had remained? Number 9. Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, Mississippi, the state capital, is a city where white flight has been both visible and persistent. Over 80% of Jackson's population is black, and this demographic shift has been a defining feature of the city's evolution. Historically, white residents began leaving the city during the Civil Rights Movement, and the migration continued as the black population grew in power and numbers. White families sought refuge in nearby suburban areas like Madison County and Rankin County, leaving behind a city that once represented white political and economic control. As white families exited, so did their influence, funding, and political support. What followed was a slow decline in city services, schools, and infrastructure. The inner neighborhoods, which once were flourishing with opportunity, were left to deal with the consequences of a deepening racial divide. But Jackson, despite being abandoned, remains a testament to resilience. Black leadership and communities have worked tirelessly to rebuild, revitalizing cultural landmarks, local businesses, and the overall spirit of the city. Yet the lingering question is, was Jackson's decline due to its growing black population, or did it fall because of the mass exodus of those who controlled its resources? The future of Jackson might depend on this very question.
10. Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, once a booming industrial powerhouse, is the ultimate example of white flight in America. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the city went from being 85% white to over 75% black. This dramatic shift was not just due to migration, it was sparked by systemic racism, blockbusting, redlining, and a rapidly changing economic landscape. As black families moved into Detroit in the wake of the Great Migration, many white families packed up and left, fearing the loss of their political and social power. The once thriving neighborhoods in the city's western districts gradually became predominantly black, leading to further disinvestment, school closures, and a sense of abandonment. Today, the city is more racially diverse, but the racial divide remains palpable. The perception of Philadelphia's black-majority neighborhoods as unsafe or economically unstable has contributed to the continued flight of white residents to suburban areas like Montgomery County and Bucks County. Yet despite the challenges, Philadelphia's black residents have worked to keep the city alive. New black-owned businesses are popping up, cultural landmarks are flourishing, and the city's vibrant black community continues to be a force in local politics and culture. But here's the question. Is Philadelphia really struggling because of its changing racial dynamics, or is it simply the result of those who left, leaving behind a city to fend for itself? Could the city have thrived if the resources and investments had stayed in the heart of the city? 11. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, one of America's oldest cities, is home to a rich history of revolution, culture, and diversity. But in recent decades, the city has seen a shift that has left many white residents packing their bags. Historically, West Philadelphia was home to a thriving working-class white community. But as black families began moving into the area in the 1970s and 1980s, many white families fled, fearing the loss of their political and social power. The once thriving neighborhoods in the city's western districts gradually became predominantly black, leading to further disinvestment, school closures, and a sense of abandonment. Today, the city is more racially diverse, but the racial divide remains palpable. The perception of Philadelphia's black-majority neighborhoods as unsafe or economically unstable has contributed to the continued flight of white residents to suburban areas like Montgomery County and Bucks County. Yet, despite the challenges, Philadelphia's black residents have worked to keep the city alive. New black-owned businesses are popping up, cultural landmarks are flourishing, and the city's vibrant black community continues to be a force in local politics and culture. But here's the question. Is Philadelphia really struggling because of its changing racial dynamics, or is it simply the result of those who left, leaving behind a city to fend for itself? Could the city have thrived if the resources and investments had stayed in the heart of the city? 12. Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee, a city known for its rich cultural heritage, particularly in the music and civil rights movements, has faced its own version of white flight. Once a city with a strong white population in areas like Midtown and Overton Park, Memphis saw a dramatic demographic shift as black families moved in. As black residents began to claim more political and economic power, white families, particularly those with the means to do so, fled to the suburbs. The city is now nearly 65% black, with the suburban areas around it growing rapidly in both population and economic stature. As white families left, so did much of the city's financial and educational support. The neighborhoods in central Memphis began to see more economic challenges, with schools struggling, businesses closing, and community investment waning. But Memphis's story is one of survival. Black entrepreneurs, artists, and activists have worked hard to reclaim and rebuild the city's cultural legacy. Yet the lingering question is Memphis facing economic decline because of its black majority or because white families took the investment and resources with them? Could the city have been a different kind of beacon of change if the resources had remained in the heart of the city?
13. Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky is a city where racial dynamics have shifted significantly over the past few decades. Once a predominantly white city, Louisville has seen a dramatic increase in its black population, particularly in neighborhoods like the West End. As the black community grew in both numbers and influence, white residents began to move out, often heading to suburban areas like St. Matthews and Prospect. The shift was not just about the population increase, it was about the loss of control and the discomfort that many white families felt as they watched the city's identity change. With the departure of many white residents came the loss of key investments. The West End, once a thriving mixed-race neighborhood, suffered from disinvestment, leading to economic struggles, underfunded schools, and a sense of neglect. Despite this, the black community in Louisville has fought to rebuild, with black-owned businesses, cultural institutions, and civic leaders continuing to drive the city's growth. But the question remains, was Louisville's decline a result of its racial shift, or was it caused by the disinvestment that followed white flight? Could the city have been a beacon of integration and progress if the resources had stayed and invested in the city's diverse communities? 14. New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans, Louisiana is a city that has always been defined by its diversity. Its mix of French, African, and Creole cultures has shaped its unique identity. But over the years, as the black population has grown, especially in neighborhoods like the lower Ninth Ward, white families began to move out. This flight didn't just happen after Hurricane Katrina. It was the culmination of years of racial tension, economic disparity, and fears about integration. As black families began to take control of the city's political and economic power, white residents retreated to the suburbs, leaving behind a city struggling to recover from both the physical destruction of the hurricane and the social fallout of white flight. While New Orleans has always had a vibrant black community, the recent demographic changes have highlighted deeper issues of racial inequality and disinvestment. As the city's black population grew, so did the challenges of poverty, education, and access to city services. But here's the real question. Is New Orleans struggling because of its changing racial makeup, or because of the systemic neglect and abandonment that followed the mass exodus of white families? Could New Orleans have rebounded from its challenges more effectively if the resources had remained and invested in the city's diverse communities? 15. Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. didn't just become the nation's capital. It became the beating heart of Black America, proudly known as Chocolate City. By the 1970s, the city's black population soared past 70%, fueled by the Great Migration when thousands of African Americans moved north from the Jim Crow South in search of federal jobs, education, and a chance to breathe free. Black culture, politics, and music flourished here, from go-go beats to black mayors shaping the city's future. But while the city grew stronger and more unapologetically black, white residents were quietly heading for the exits. Why? For many, integration wasn't what they signed up for. The shift in political power, black leadership in government, and neighborhoods filled with new faces made white residents uncomfortable. Instead of embracing the change, they packed up for the leafy suburbs of Maryland and Northern Virginia, Montgomery County, Fairfax, Arlington, where schools, Safety and stability became the coded language for less diversity. The irony, while D.C. was painted as dangerous and declining, it was actually alive with culture, activism, and identity. The city wasn't falling apart, it was transforming into a capital that finally reflected the people who built it. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Across America, cities where black communities grew strong became the same places white residents quietly packed up and left. Not because of hurricanes, housing costs, or jobs, but because the color of the neighborhood shifted and made them uneasy. The black population rose, culture flourished, and suddenly the suburbs felt like the only refuge for those unwilling to share power. If black growth is the trigger and white discomfort the pattern, then how long before every thriving black city is branded too much to handle?